Okay, question from the obsessive cyclist. What is more effective for a time crunched cyclist with 4 to 6 hours to train a week? Polarized or sweet spot? It's an interesting question because it really, I'm afraid people don't really fully understand what polarized training means. We seem to think it means something relative to the amount of time you put in training, but it's not that at all. It's really, the research for this is based on workouts. So if you did a workout that included high intensity, that was a hard workout, no matter if you only had 10 minutes of high intensity or an hour of high intensity. It was one workout, high intensity. So it's not quite an hourly sort of thing that you're trying to figure out. But let me give you a simpler way to think about this within the context of this polarized idea of being 80-20. Think of it in terms of being 5 easy days a week and 2 hard days a week. That's a much better way of thinking about this whole concept. So the 2 hard days a week can be anything like in zones 4 or 5, high intensity. That's the 20%. 2 times a week, 2 workouts a week, high intensity like that. It's going to give you the what you need as far as the intensity of training. The other 5 workouts are all low intensity, zones 1 and 2. So the biggest bulk of your training is very boring. 5 days a week, you're just going out and doing easy workouts, easy rides. 2 days a week should be dreaded. They should be so hard, you're thinking about them for several days in advance about how hard that workout is going to be. So if you do that, you've solved the problem of how much do I do of which types of workouts, because now we're going to do workouts which are right around your threshold, your anaerobic threshold, lactate threshold, functional threshold, whatever you want to call it. We're going to do those 1 day a week. And we're also going to do 1 other day a week of very high intensity VO2 max type of stuff. So we're doing a range of workouts that go from zone 4 through zone 5. Then on the other end, we're doing those 5 workouts, which are entirely the opposite. Very, very easy. They're all zone 1 or zone 2. So that is the concept of polarized. So what I'm suggesting to you is we're combining those 2 ideas. Sweet spot and polarized are being combined into a week of training where you've got 2 workouts that are on the high end, zones 4 and 5. Polarized, sweet spot training really takes place at around the 4 zone, low 4 zone is what we're talking about, around 90% of FTP. And so what we're doing here is we're using that as a lower end of this range of workouts that make up these 2 hard days. So in a nutshell, that's what it's all about. Should you look at this in terms of how can I distribute those hard workouts? Can I do, instead of doing them 2 days a week, if I'm only riding 4 days a week, can I do them each of the 4 days? I would suggest that's not generally a good idea. We need to get some aerobic training in there also, which requires some dedicated time. If you only have an hour to train for one of those days, and it's going to be an easy workout, one of those, on the low end, zones 1 and 2, then I would suggest making that into a 1 hour aerobic ride. By aerobic, I mean at your aerobic threshold. So what is your aerobic threshold? Well, if you have a heart rate monitor and you know what your zones are, using the system that I use, you can assume that your aerobic threshold is roughly 30 beats per minute below your functional threshold or anaerobic threshold, that higher threshold. So 30 beats below that is your aerobic threshold. You need to get lots of time doing that also. Bike races, triathlons, mountain bike racing, and so forth are highly aerobic events. Anything over 2 minutes is highly aerobic. And so we're talking about events which are an hour or multi-hour long. So they are extremely aerobic events. So you don't want to spend all your time just working on the high intensity stuff. You also have to build that aerobic base of fitness. So we need to get aerobic fitness in, and we also need to get the higher intensity workouts in within the same weeks. That's what the polarized research has shown, that for athletes at all levels, from novice to pro, spending a great deal of time at around aerobic threshold has a great benefit for performance in an aerobic endurance event like we're all doing. We're all doing these long type events, which last for, in some cases, multi-hours. and you just don't train for those by going out and doing 3-minute intervals. That's not going to get you ready for it. 3-minute intervals have their place, but there is a need also to develop this aerobic fitness. And you can't get there by doing high intensity. It's specific to the system we're talking about. Question from Oli Atten: is pedal-based power meter better than a crank-based power meter? Well, I've got a lot of experience with this. I got my first power meter in 1994. And I've been using power meters ever since then. I've had just about I think I've had actually every type there is. There's crank-based systems, there's spider-based systems, there's hub-based systems, and of course, there's pedal-based systems. Of all of those, I would certainly say that the pedal-based is far easier to work with. For one thing, for example, I've got multiple bikes. I'm sure many of the listeners also have multiple bikes. Road bike. I've got one road bike, and I've also got a gravel bike, and I've also got a bike I have on my indoor trainer. And swapping pedals means that I've always got the same power measuring devices being used every time I ride, which is really a big benefit. Otherwise, if you don't have the same power meters, like if I'm using, for example, crank-based, it's a real hassle to try to change the cranks between bikes. That means I'm going to have to wind up having 2 power meters. So not only does the price of having power go up by having multiple power meters, but also just a hassle of trying to change them if you don't want to spend the extra money to buy a second one. The hassle of trying to have one power meter service 2 bikes is really beyond what most people really want to do. So the power-based system using a pedal is a much easier way of making sure you've got good power that's always consistent between bikes and is easily interchangeable between bikes. Chap MS underline 11 asks, is the ramp test better than the 20-minute FTP test? There are actually many, many different ways of testing FTP. And it comes down, quite honestly, to what fits best with your particular style of training and your particular needs. Their numbers are not going to be exactly the same all the time, but they're going to be pretty much small ballpark. So there's going to be a lot of overlap between the systems. For example, you can do the ramp test, which I won't go into details of, but basically every few minutes, like every 3 minutes, you increase the intensity and see what happens as far as power output over time. There's a 20-minute test, which is probably the most common way of doing this. I used to use a 30-minute test with my athletes. Instead of subtracting the 5% like you do with a 20-minute test, I wouldn't subtract anything. We just take 30-minute power and assume that is FTP. Won't go into details of why on that. There's a system you can use based on doing intervals, 8-minute intervals, taking your power from each of those intervals and using that to estimate your FTP. There's even a 5-minute test, an all-out 5-minute test, and you use a certain percentage of that to imply what your FTP is. Now, the caveat here is, though, that we're not all the same as athletes. Some of us are very highly anaerobic. Some of us have a very well-established aerobic system, but we're not nearly as powerful anaerobically. So if you're an anaerobic athlete and you do a 30-minute test, for example, or even a 20-minute test, that's going to feel like a much bigger challenge for you than a 5-minute test is going to feel like. And just the opposite for the athlete who is endowed with great aerobic fitness, but not so much anaerobic fitness. So the bottom line is, find one system that works for you, one method that works for you, and use it every time. Don't try going back and forth between all these systems or routines. Find one that works best for you and use it all the time. How accurate are they? Well, there's a lot of debate about this. There's research showing recently that, for example, the 20-minute test, your power output is something like 10% higher than if you found the athlete's power at their maximum lactate steady state, which is essentially what we're trying to do with a power test, is find your maximum lactate steady state, which is a physiological term. So we're trying to bypass the physiology here and get to the functional side of this, which is the 20-minute test minus 5%. So the bottom line is, find the test that works best for you and stick with that every time you test your FTP. Revert 510 asks, are base miles still as important as once thought, or can intervals cover base too? Well, base miles, yes, are very important. That's not gone away. Physiology has not changed over the decades. We've been doing base miles for many, many decades. This goes back to the early 1900s when athletes were doing aerobic type exercise to build fitness. And then later on began to learn that if they sprinkled in some high intensity along with that, they could get this nice mix of aerobic fitness and even highly anaerobic fitness. So we can get those blended together, but you can't get one by doing the other. You're not going to become highly anaerobic in terms of your fitness needs for a race, for example, by doing just strictly aerobic workouts, nor are you going to become aerobically fit just by doing highly intense anaerobic workouts. So there is certainly a need for both of these things. The most standard way of doing this, and this is always open for debate, is athletes start off by doing their aerobic training first. So they build a base, if you will, of aerobic fitness. And then later on, they begin to bring in the higher intensity training as they get closer to their event, which I'm assuming is going to be a high intensity event, like a bike race, for example. And so what you want to do is in the last few weeks before a high intensity event, or any race, actually, you want to start training with the demands of that race in mind. So if the race is going to be highly anaerobic, you need to start doing much more highly anaerobic training as you get closer to the race. If the race is more like an Ironman distance race, you need to start doing a lot more training like an Ironman distance race as you get closer to the race, which means a certain intensity, which is appropriate for that type of event. So the whole idea here is that we're trying to make sure we build a base of fitness, because that's important all by itself. And then later on, we're going to upgrade that level of fitness we have by adding anaerobic fitness. So yes, base fitness is still very important for your performance in terms of all kinds of racing. Again, whenever we start talking about things that are aerobic versus anaerobic, 2 minutes is kind of the cutoff. At 2 minutes, you're about 50-50 as far as anaerobic versus aerobic output. You're working equally hard for both systems. As we go beyond 2 minutes, it starts shifting towards aerobic, and there's less anaerobic involvement into performance. So we need to get this, and since we're talking about multi-hour events usually, we need to start working on building this base of fitness so we can go the distance and then start sprinkling in the high intensity training later on that brings about this race specific fitness that we need for race day.